just sometimes we struggle and sometimes we get sick. It's the same as any other physical illness himself. And I think a lot of men in those positions and women in those positions put that pressure on themselves. And no one else is putting it on them, but that's just how they're hardwired.
Right.
So we have to break the stigma. We have to create space for people to be willing to step into the light and raise their hand and say, I need help. And for people to be receptive to that and allow that to happen. And it doesn't disqualify them from ministry. It doesn't disqualify them from their vocation. It doesn't disqualify them from anything.
That is life. Just the Lord gave it to you in the most extreme possible ways, right? We all have those spaces in between.
Right.
Did this cause you at some point to question your faith? All these believers out there that are listening to this beautiful, godly woman, was there a point where you just went, I just don't know?
It's a wrestling. It's an everyday wrestling with God. I often find myself at the end of the day on my knees in my bedroom asking God, why in the world did you trust me with this?
Yes.
Why in the world did you allow this to happen? And what in the world do you want me to do? So it's this, I still believe in God, and I still believe God is good, and I still believe God is kind, and I believe that this broke God's heart. I believe this absolutely broke God's heart and that it wasn't God's plan A for Andrew's life. But God has been so kind to us, and so I've been able to lean into his kindness and fall into his kindness and just fall into the life that he has for us now. And I feel like him and I together are rebuilding this beautiful life. I call it rebuilding beautiful. It's this phrase that I have, and I had a beautiful life, and I loved my life with Andrew. I truly loved it. I loved being a pastor's wife. I loved sitting in the front row on the right on Sundays, watching my guy on stage. I loved all the behind the scenes stuff. I loved my life. And so to have this life that you love stripped away, and you have to start all over from the dust. It's this rebuilding, and I'm doing that with God, even more intimately than I've ever known. I feel like I've gotten to know God, and my faith has gone so much deeper than it was before.
Amazing. And you're serving God. It's obvious to me, having met you, and I'd heard about you. Many of you may not know this, but their church is in the town, basically, that Christiane and I grew up in, and my entire family lives there, and some of my family goes to church there. And so I had heard about you, but it's so obvious when I'm in your presence why the Lord would choose you to carry this burden and this message, because you won't always feel it, but you're ready for this. And she has this great blog you should all see called God's Got This .com. They write beautiful blogs on there, and that blog actually started when Dave had his leukemia battle, correct? And everyone praying for Dave. And it's just interesting that now it can be used for this purpose as well, and that the Lord's using you this way. I just think you're remarkable, and it's just striking me as I'm in your presence, because there's some people you meet in your life that just God's grace and God's goodness is all over them. When you look at you, you see it. It comes out in your voice, and I just want you to know that God's favor's on you. I can see it. And I think you're just remarkable. I'm so taken away with you. It just blows my mind. Let's help some people some more, because you're certainly doing that. But if you went back and looked at this again, and did Drew show signs of this prior? In other words, when you met him, did he always sort of struggle with being down when you were younger, even in your courtship, or was it just the time with Dad and then taking over the church, or did you see even some predisposition, so to speak, for this prior, would you say?
Yeah, Andrew, he had a very intense personality. He was driven for excellence, had a hard time relaxing, so kind of just had this bent towards not being able to relax well. Just driven, typical CEO, businessman, just ready to go. And so he just had more of a bent towards that, a bit more serious. You would think he was more serious and more introverted if you met him, which is surprising. I think a lot of people think pastors are extroverted just because they're on the stage, but most of them are probably introverted. And so not a large circle of friends, not very outgoing, had a very tight circle, a couple of close friends, and his family was everything to him. So not huge signs of mental illness, but definitely a bent towards just being more of an intense, driven person.
Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like you just described me. And I think people listening to this would say that. But you also described a lot of people who listen to the show. And I was telling you off camera, if I'm being candid with my audience, that I think all different types of people suffer from mental illness. So there's not a type by any means. But one of the things that people who listen to the show are, for the most part, people trying to achieve. And I was telling you this off camera and you agreed. I want everyone to hear this. The number one thing on my show when I started with all these achievers was, I wonder what they all have in common.
Right.
Are they all brilliant? Are they all super hardworking? Was there some luck that happened? And in all their cases, there's some variables. But what shocked me was the number one category I could put them in after I got to know them all is they, not all, but a majority of them suffer with some form of depression, some form of anxiety. And I think it's because, and you were saying this with Drew too, I think to some extent they're perfectionists, they want to do so well, they set this standard for themselves that they're just never living up to. Right. And although that's a healthy formula for achievement, it's not always a healthy formula for peace, for fulfillment. And if you have a bent, so to speak, towards mental illness, there's a road you must be careful you don't go down. For most people, that incongruency is very healthy. But if you also have this other bent, I love your word, you need to be mindful of this. Would you not agree that he sort of fits that profile too?
I would, yeah. I think people that are driven like that have a really hard time having a solid community around them, taking time for themselves, taking time for their friends, taking time for their family, and also just resting, like allowing themselves to have margin to rest. Andrew could have taken a year off of work and no one would have said a peep about it. But he did. He had that pressure on himself. And I think a lot of men in those positions and women in those positions put that pressure on themselves. And no one else is putting it on them, but that's just how they're hardwired. You're
right. And there's this thing now, I'm so glad you're saying this because I've made this mistake. There's like this thing, especially in personal development or business or sports, there's like this nobility or badge of honor in fatigue, in work all the time, grind. And I'm a guy who's preached to some extent some of that.
Yeah.
But I've learned that the rest in between, there's a reason why there's a Sabbath day.
Right.
The Lord gave us that day for a reason, for rest, right? And you need rest in your life. You need recuperation of your spirit, of your mind, of your body, all of it. All of you achievers listening to this, you've got to give yourself some rest because although it may not lead to you harming yourself or your family, it will just lead to you not being the best version of you burning out. Yeah. One of the things I admire so much about you is you've honored him since his passing. The things you post on the blog, it seems to it's honest, but you really seem to still honor and love this man so deeply. Yeah. And I think that's wonderful, as your children grow up seeing that. Yeah. Because I don't want people to think earlier when you said, well, I've removed these things of him. This man is center in your world. Yeah. You talk about him regularly. Talk about that for a second. Was that a conscious decision or is that just born out of your love for him anyways? Or did you choose to speak about him the way you do still?
All of it's been so organic. I pretty much from the first week I wrote him this letter that we put on our blog, and the letter kind of just went viral. Our story spread like wildfire, like all around the world. I was getting messages from people all around the world. My social media blew up, and really, I think from the beginning I just wanted to protect his name. I think that sometimes suicide just has this bad reputation and you blame the person and there's shame, and a lot of families won't even say that their loved one died by suicide because they're ashamed. And they think that by saying that, people are going to speculate that it was their fault or what was wrong with them, and there's this shame that surrounds that. So I, from the beginning, wanted his life to always be defined by the way he lived, not the way he died. So it's been so important to me to protect his name, and I've just done that organically since the beginning by writing. I've written a series of letters to him, and talking about him, and all of it's, honest, just how I feel about him, and I still love him deeply and still care about him so much, and can't wait to see him again. Life is so short, and I'm going to see him again soon. Yeah.
There's been talk that someone with any kind of mental illness shouldn't lead a church, which means people think someone suffering from mental illness shouldn't lead a company, shouldn't lead a sports team. And that somehow that disqualifies you, especially in the faith space, that if you struggle with anxiety or you struggle with depression or you struggle with any kind of mental illness, even anger issues, that somehow that disqualifies you. I'm of the opinion that we're all sinners saved by the grace of God, and it's our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses that help us connect with other people in our churches and our companies, on social media and business and sports. But what is your take on that? Have you heard that? Has that been something that's been messaged to you?
And I think that's the reason why a lot of people don't admit that they're struggling. I think a lot of people struggle silently in the dark, and that they really struggle on their own by themselves with suicidal thoughts, with depression, and with anxiety, because they're afraid if they actually tell people how they're actually doing, they're going to lose their job, or they're going to lose their business, or they're going to lose their family. And so they struggle silently, and it's so heartbreaking. So we have to break the stigma. We have to create space for people to be willing to step into the light and raise their hand and say, I need help. And for people to be receptive to that and allow that to happen. And it doesn't disqualify them from ministry. It doesn't disqualify them from their vocation. It doesn't disqualify them from anything. You know, it's just sometimes we struggle and sometimes we get sick. It's the same as any other physical illness. If someone got cancer, you wouldn't pull them out of their position, right? You would walk alongside them and try to get them the help that they need. And I think at some points it probably is good to take time off and rest if you're struggling and you've been running fast for a long time and you feel burnt out. There's nothing wrong with stepping away from a season like Andrew did and saying, hey, I need rest. I'm going to come back, and I can't wait to come back, but I got to take some time and have that self-care time for me.
And you got to find that rest, by the way. If you can't take months off, it's finding hours after work where your phone just must be down, or it's taking that weekend, or certainly your Sunday, or if I was reading this article the other day about the amount of unused vacation days in the United States.
Wow.
It's this massive number. I'm forgetting the statistic, but it's like 60% of all the vacation days afforded to employees in the United States aren't taken and used.
That's so sad.
And the average person only gets 2 of them a year, and the average person is not even taking these 2 weeks to rest and recuperate. That's very much an American thing. It's this grind work thing the attachment to it isn't admired and respected all over the world. It's in some places, but it's something in our country that rest is almost frowned upon. So I'm so grateful that you point that out.
And I think social media has just made that so much worse. It's the striving. It's the seeing what everybody else is doing and trying to keep up and striving and going, and especially for pastors too. It's just, I got to keep up with everybody.
I know. It's the growth.
Hey guys, thanks for sticking around. If you'd like more, click the videos right here. They're exactly what you need to see next. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and become a part of the Max Out community. And tell me what you think about the videos in the comments below. I read all of them every week, and I select winners that get all kinds of prizes, gear, coaching calls with me. Make a comment.